Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Introduction. The Golden Legion. In the grim darkness of the far future, where humanity clings to existence across a million worlds, where faith and fanaticism are the only shields against an uncaring cosmos, there exists a force so elite, so perfectly crafted, that even the legendary Space Marines pale in comparison. They are the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, the golden armored guardians who stand between the Emperor of mankind and the Abyss. Their story is one of unparalleled dedication, of warriors who have stood vigil for over 10,000 years, of beings who represent the pinnacle of what humanity can achieve when touched by the divine will of the Emperor himself. To understand the Custodes is to peer into a mystery wrapped in legend. They are not soldiers, though they wage war with devastating efficiency. But they are not merely bodyguards, though they guard the most precious soul in the galaxy. They are something far more profound, something that transcends the simple categories we use to define warriors and protectors. Each custodian is a work of art, a masterpiece of genetic engineering and psychological conditioning that took the Emperor himself to create. Where Space Marines are mass-produced weapons forged in batches of thousands, custodians are individually sculpted treasures, no two exactly alike, each bearing the personal touch of humanity's greatest genius. Imagine warriors who stand taller than even the superhuman Astartes, clad in armor of gleaming auramite that catches the light like captured sunlight. Their weapons are not mere tools of war, but relics in their own right. Guardian spears and sentinel blades that have tasted the blood of humanity's greatest enemies for millennia. Their minds are as sharp as their blades, trained not just in the arts of war, but in philosophy, history, diplomacy, and countless other disciplines that would take normal humans lifetimes to master. They can debate the finest points of imperial law with the same ease that they can dismember a greater demon with their bare hands. The number 10,000 is not arbitrary. It is said that the Emperor decreed this would be the strength of his Golden Guard, and for 10 millennia they have maintained this sacred number through methods known only to themselves. Unlike the Space Marines, who are organized into chapters of 1,000 warriors, the Custodes stand as a singular force, united in purpose and unbreakable in loyalty. They do not know the concept of defeat, for to record a battle as lost by the Adeptus Custodes is considered heresy by the Administratum itself. Such is their reputation, such is their legend. But what truly sets the 10,000 apart is not their physical prowess or their gleaming armor. It is their purpose. While Space Marines are created to conquer and defend the Imperium, the Custodes were made for one singular, overwhelming duty: to protect the Emperor, not the Imperium, not humanity as a whole. The Emperor himself. This distinction might seem subtle, but it defines everything about them. For 10,000 years, as the Imperium crumbled and burned, as entire sectors fell to darkness, and Xenos horrors ravaged countless worlds, the Custodes remained within the walls of the Imperial Palace, guarding a nearly dead god upon his golden throne. They chose loyalty to their master over loyalty to his realm, and this choice would haunt them for millennia. Their presence inspires awe even among the most hardened imperial warriors. When a custodian walks through a crowd, people do not simply see a soldier. They see a living connection to the Emperor himself, a being who has stood in his presence, who carries within them a spark of his divine will. Inquisitors and Space Marine. Chapter Masters must kneel before them. High Lords of Terror defer to their authority, for the Custodes speak with the voice of the Emperor, and their will, within the confines of the Imperial Palace and matters concerning the Emperor's safety, is absolute. Their history spans the entire breadth of human civilization's greatest achievements and darkest failures. They have witnessed the birth of the Imperium and watched it slowly decay over 10 millennia of war and suffering. They have seen the Emperor walk among men as a living god, and have kept vigil over his broken form as it clings to a half-life sustained only by the Golden Throne and the daily sacrifice of thousands of psykers. They remember the Great Crusade, when humanity reached out to reclaim the stars, and they remember the Horus Heresy, when brothers turned upon brothers, and the dream of unity shattered into civil war and bloodshed. This is their story, the story of the 10,000, the story of warriors who were created to be perfect and have lived long enough to see perfection become an impossible dream. The story of guardians who failed to protect their charge and have spent 10,000 years seeking redemption through unwavering service. The story of the Emperor's companions, his friends, his confidants, reduced to silent watchers over a corpse that refuses to die. And most recently, it is the story of a force awakening from centuries of self-imposed isolation, stepping once more onto the galactic stage to bring the Emperor's wrath to those who would threaten humanity's survival. Origins in the Age of Strife. Long before the Imperium rose to unite humanity under a single banner, long before the Space Marine legions were even conceived, the Emperor of mankind walked terror in the shadows, guiding humanity through the darkness of old night. This was the Age of Strife, a period when humanity's first stellar empire had collapsed, when warp storms cut off worlds from one another, when terror itself had devolved into a patchwork of warring nations ruled by techno-barbarian warlords and petty tyrants. It was an age of horror and regression, where the knowledge and achievements of earlier eras had been lost or corrupted, where might made right and civilization hung by the thinnest of threads. The Emperor had watched and waited for millennia, but now the time for action had come. He emerged from the shadows and began the Wars of Unification, a brutal campaign to unite all of Terra under his rule. But even with his own immense psychic powers and strategic genius, the Emperor knew he would need warriors who could match his vision. He needed protectors who could stand by his side as he walked through the fires of war, who could be trusted absolutely, who could serve as the foundation upon which his greater plans would be built. And so, drawing upon genetic lore accumulated over many lifetimes, knowledge gathered from the darkest ages of human history, and perhaps even from sources lost to time, the Emperor created the first custodians. This was not the relatively straightforward process he would later use to create the Space Marines. Each custodian was a unique creation, an individual masterwork that required the Emperor's personal attention and expertise. The process began with infants taken from the noble houses of Terra, children barely old enough to survive the transformation that would remake them into something transcendent. The genetic modification that forms a custodian is fundamentally different from that which creates a Space Marine. Elsewhere, the Astartes are implanted with gene seed organs that alter their physiology over time. The Custodes undergo a transformation that begins at the genetic level itself. Every cell in their body is rewritten, enhanced, perfected. The Emperor himself oversaw each transformation, making minute adjustments and refinements that would make every custodian unique. No two share the exact same genetic template. Each is a singular work of art that can never be precisely replicated. This individual craftsmanship meant that custodians could never be mass-produced like their Astartes cousins. Creating a Space Marine takes time and resources, certainly, but it is a standardized process that can be replicated across thousands of subjects. Creating a custodian requires resources and expertise that make each one irreplaceable. The Emperor was, as he himself admitted, miserly with the lives of his custodians. He would spend the lives of countless other servants without hesitation, but each custodian represented an investment that could not easily be replaced. The first known appearance of the Custodes in the historical records comes from early in the Unification Wars, during the fall of the techno-barbarian fortress at Nassau. Here, golden armored warriors appeared alongside the Emperor's forces, cutting through enemy lines with a precision and lethality that seemed almost supernatural. The fortress fell, its defenders broken by warriors who moved with a grace and purpose that set them apart from even the Thunder Warriors, those brutal proto-Astartes who served as the Emperor's primary military force during the unification. But the true origins of the Custodian Guard remain shrouded in myth and legend. Some fragments of ancient records, carefully preserved in gene-sealed tomes and stasis-locked scraps of parchment, speak of trusted bodyguards and advisors who served the Emperor even before the unification wars began. Cave etchings and hieroglyphics hint at great victories, won against monstrous beings, suggesting that the Custodes or their predecessors may have existed in some form for far longer than official history's record. What is known with certainty is that by the time the unification wars reached their climax, the Custodes had reached their full strength of 10,000 warriors. They were organized into units called shield companies, led by officers who would later be known as shield captains. At their head stood Constantin Valdor, a warrior of such exceptional skill and dedication that he would become legendary even among the Custodes themselves. Valdor was more than just a skilled combatant. He was the Emperor's right hand, his closest confidant, his friend in a way that transcended the normal relationship between master and servant. The Custodes of this early era wore red cloaks and the finest armor that Terran artificers could produce. Their weapons were masterworks, each one unique and perfectly suited to its bearer. They fought alongside the Emperor as he united Terra, standing guard as he forged alliances with the Mechanicum of Mars, protecting him as he navigated the treacherous political waters of forging a unified, planetary government from dozens of warring factions. Unlike the Thunder Warriors, who were brutes designed for overwhelming force, the Custodes represented a more refined approach to warrior creation. They possessed not just physical prowess, but intellectual depth. They were trained in arts of assassination and counterintelligence, understanding that the greatest threat to the Emperor might not come from an enemy army, but from a single assassin with sufficient skill and determination. This led to the creation of the Blood Games, a practice where custodians would attempt to reach the Emperor using any means necessary, testing the palace's defenses and their own ability to think like would-be assassins. The most famous of these early Blood Games involved a custodian who successfully infiltrated deep into the Imperial Palace, demonstrating that even the Emperor's own security could be breached with sufficient cunning. Rather than being punished, this custodian was celebrated for exposing a vulnerability that could then be corrected. This exemplifies the custodian mindset: absolute dedication to their duty, even if it means taking actions that might seem disloyal or dangerous. Their loyalty is not blind obedience, but rather an intelligent understanding of what their master truly needs. As the unification wars drew to a close, and Terra finally stood united under the Emperor's rule, the Custodes had proven themselves indispensable. They were the golden standard against which all other warriors would be measured. When the Emperor turned his gaze to the stars and began planning the Great Crusade that would reunite humanity across the galaxy, the Custodes would be there, standing at his side as they had from the beginning. But the Great Crusade would bring new challenges, new threats, and new comrades in arms who would both respect and, in some cases, resent the golden-armored warriors who held the Emperor's closest confidence. The creation of the Space Marine legions would change the dynamic of the Emperor's forces. These new warriors, created using gene seed harvested from the Emperor's genetic sons, the Primarchs, would number in the hundreds of thousands. They would be the hammer with which the Emperor would smash his way across the galaxy. But while the legions conquered worlds, the Custodes would remain what they had always been: the shield that protected humanity's greatest champion. Not soldiers for an army, but companions for a god walking among men. The Great Crusade era, when the Emperor looked to the stars and saw the scattered remnants of humanity crying out in the darkness, and isolated and besieged by Xenos horrors and the predations of the warp, he knew that reunification would require a military force unlike anything Terra had yet produced. The Thunder Warriors had served their purpose in uniting terror, but they were too unstable, too uncontrollable for the precise and sustained campaign that would be needed to reclaim the galaxy. Thus were born the Space Marine Legions, 20 great hosts led by the Emperor's genetic sons, the Primarchs. These would be the conquerors, the liberators, the tip of the spear that would pierce through the darkness and bring the light of imperial truth to every corner of human space. But even as these mighty legions were created, even as they grew to number in the hundreds of thousands, the Custodes remained apart. They did not join the legions in their great crusades, but they did not lead conquering armies across the stars. Instead, they remained what they had always been, the Emperor's companions. A contingent of Custodes always accompanied the Emperor wherever he went, an honor guard of the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. When the Emperor walked onto a newly compliant world, it was the golden forms of his custodians that flanked him, their presence a living declaration of his power and majesty. This created a complex relationship between the Custodes and the Space Marines. On one level, there was profound respect. The Space Marines understood that the Custodes represented the absolute pinnacle of the Emperor's genetic art. Each custodian could face multiple Astartes in combat and emerge victorious. Their skills were honed to a degree that most Space Marines could only dream of achieving. While when a custodian offered counsel or criticism, even the proudest Legion captains would listen, for they spoke with the authority of one who stood daily in the Emperor's presence. Yet there was also tension. The Space Marines were sons of their Primarchs, bound together by shared gene seed and brotherhood. They fought as units, as companies and chapters, each warrior supporting his brothers in pursuit of common goals. The Custodes fought as individuals. Each was a tower of might unto himself, trained to operate independently rather than as part of a greater tactical whole. This fundamental difference in philosophy and training sometimes led to friction on the battlefield, where custodian tactics seemed arrogant or reckless to Space Marines, who valued coordinated action above individual glory. What's more troubling was the fact that the Custodes were also watchers. The Emperor sent individual custodians to accompany various legions during the Great Crusade, ostensibly as envoys and liaisons. But everyone understood their true purpose. They were the Emperor's eyes and ears, present to ensure that his wayward sons remained loyal and true to his vision. The Primarchs, those demigod generals who commanded vast armies and conquered entire sectors, chafed under this oversight. They were the Emperor's sons, his chosen instruments. The presence of custodian watchers implied a lack of trust that many Primarchs found insulting. Constantin Valdor navigated these treacherous political waters with his characteristic stoicism and wisdom. As Captain General of the Legio Custodes, and he served on the War Council alongside the greatest military minds of the Imperium. He advised the Emperor on strategic matters, coordinated with the Primarchs when necessary, and ensured that the Custodes fulfilled their duty without unnecessarily antagonizing the Space Marine legions. It was a delicate balance, requiring not just martial prowess, but diplomatic skill and political acumen. The Custodes of this era were equipped with the finest war gear that the Imperium could produce. Their armor was not the mass-produced power armor worn by Astartes, but individually crafted suits of auramite-plated perfection. Each suit was a work of art, adorned with gems harvested from the depths of terror and worked by master artisans. Their weapons were similarly unique. Guardian spears, as those iconic polearms that combined a power blade with an integrated bolter, were the signature weapons of the Custodian Guard. But each warrior carried weapons suited to his individual fighting style and preferences. During the Great Crusade, the Custodes participated in some of the most significant military operations, though always in limited numbers. They were not deployed as shock troops or line infantry. Instead, they served in critical roles, protecting key assets, eliminating high-value targets, and ensuring that the Emperor's most important objectives were achieved. When a Primarch needed to negotiate with a particularly dangerous Xenos empire, a custodian would be present to ensure his safety. when an ancient human colony needed to be convinced to join the Imperium peacefully. The presence of golden-armored warriors made the Emperor's offer impossible to refuse. The Custodes also maintained their practice of the blood games throughout the Great Crusade. Even as the Emperor conquered world after world, even as his attention was divided across 1,000 fronts, the Custodes continued to test the palace's defenses by attempting to infiltrate it and reach the Emperor's person. These games became increasingly sophisticated, with custodians employing false identities, corrupting palace staff, and even staging elaborate scenarios to test how the palace would respond to various threats. One famous instance involved a custodian who successfully predicted and exploited a weakness in the palace's defenses that would later be used by the Alpha Legion during the Horus Heresy, potentially saving the Emperor's life. But life for a custodian during the Great Crusade was one of constant vigilance mixed with periods of intense action. When not on active duty, they trained relentlessly, honing their skills in the arts of war and in the countless other disciplines they were expected to master. Custodians were expected to be not just warriors, but scholars, poets, philosophers, and diplomats. They studied the histories of newly compliant worlds, learned the customs and languages of alien species the Imperium encountered, and engaged in philosophical debates about the nature of the Imperium they were building. This intellectual depth was intentional. The Emperor created the Custodes to be his companions as well as his guards. He wanted warriors who could engage with him on matters of philosophy and statecraft, who could offer insights and perspectives that went beyond mere tactical considerations. Constantine Valdor, in particular, was known to spend hours in discussion with the Emperor, debating everything from the nature of human potential to the philosophical implications of their crusade to bring order to the galaxy. But beneath all of this, there was a growing unease. The Custodes, with their proximity to the Emperor and their keen observational skills, began to notice troubling signs. Certain Primarchs seemed to be developing philosophies that diverged from the imperial truth. Strange reports filtered in from distant campaigns, whispers of practices and beliefs that seemed to contradict everything the Emperor had worked to build. The Custodes reported these concerns, but the Emperor was preoccupied with his great project, the Webway, as a secret undertaking that would require increasing amounts of his attention as the crusade progressed. The Emperor valued the Custodians above all his other warriors. While he was willing to expend countless Space Marines in pursuit of strategic objectives, he was always hesitant to risk his Golden Guard. Each Custodian represented not just a tremendous investment of resources and expertise, but also a personal connection to the Emperor himself. They had stood by his side since the beginning. They had witnessed his rise to power and the birth of his dream for humanity. To lose even one was a tragedy. To lose many would be catastrophic. This careful husbandry of his Custodians meant that they rarely saw combat in the way that Space Marines did. A Space Marine might fight in dozens of major campaigns during his service, facing death again and again in service to the Imperium. A Custodian might go decades between major engagements, spending most of his time on guard duty or training. This could have led to warriors growing soft or complacent, but the Custodes maintained their edge through their rigorous training regimen and the constant challenge of the blood games. As the Great Crusade reached its height, with 200 years of conquest bringing thousands of worlds into imperial compliance, the future seemed bright. The Emperor's dream of a unified humanity seemed within reach. The Custodes stood ready to guard this achievement, to protect the man who had made it all possible. They had no way of knowing that their greatest trial was approaching, that betrayal was festering in the hearts of some of the Emperor's own sons, and that soon they would be called upon to defend not just the Emperor, but the very future of humanity itself against an enemy they had never imagined, the Emperor's own gene-sons turned traitor. The Horus Heresy, terror's darkest hour. The galaxy burned. Half of the Space Marine legions had turned against the Emperor, led by his most beloved son, War Master Horus Lupercal. What had begun as a distant rebellion rapidly spiraled into a full-scale civil war, that would determine the fate of humanity itself. For the Custodes, who had served as the Emperor's companions since the earliest days of the Unification Wars, this betrayal cut deeper than any blade. They had watched the Primarchs grow from infancy, had served alongside the Space Marine legions during the Great Crusade, and now they would be forced to fight against warriors they had once called allies. But before the traitors could assault Terra itself, before the final confrontation that would decide everything, the Custodes faced a nightmare that few outside the Imperial Palace would ever know about: the war in the Webway. The Emperor had been working on a secret project, attempting to create a human-controlled passage through the Webway, that ancient Eldar network that allowed travel across the galaxy without risking the dangers of the warp. This project was meant to free humanity from dependence on warp travel and navigator-guided ships, effectively neutering the power of chaos over human civilization. But Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, had unwittingly shattered the protective wards around the Emperor's Webway project while attempting to warn his father about Horus's treachery. The psychic blast that Magnus unleashed in his hubris tore open a portal directly into the Imperial dungeon, allowing demonic entities to pour through into the very heart of the Imperial Palace. The Emperor was forced to sit upon the Golden Throne, using his own psychic might to hold the portal closed while simultaneously fighting a war against the demons that had already broken through. The defense of the Webway fell to the Custodes. Led by officers like Ra Endymion and Tribune Kadai, the Golden Warriors found themselves fighting in conditions they had never trained for, against enemies that defied all rational understanding. Our demons were not like the Xenos threats or human enemies that the Custodes had faced before. They were manifestations of emotion and thought given physical form, beings that could only truly be killed in the Imperium itself. Killing a demon in real space simply banished it back to the warp, where it would eventually reform and return. The war in the Webway dragged on for years, consuming the strength of the Custodes in a grinding war of attrition that seemed to have no end. The Golden Warriors fought alongside contingents of Sisters of Silence, whose pariah nature could disrupt the demonic entities, and alongside Mechanicum forces who brought heavy weapons and vehicles to bear. But the casualties were horrific. Custodians who had survived for centuries fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The Legio Custodes, which had numbered 10,000 at the start of the heresy, was reduced to approximately 1,000 warriors by the time the Webway War reached its peak. Each fallen custodian was a tragedy that resonated through the entire guard. These were not faceless soldiers dying in distant wars. These were brothers, companions who had trained together for decades or even centuries. Each death diminished the Custodes, not just numerically, but spiritually. They had been created to protect the Emperor, and now they were dying in droves while their master sat immobile on the Golden Throne, unable to lead them, unable to even acknowledge their sacrifice, except through the occasional psychic sending. The conditions in the Webway were nightmarish. The Custodes fought in crystalline corridors that twisted in impossible geometries, where the laws of physics became suggestions and reality itself seemed unstable. Demons emerged from tears in the fabric of space, some of them greater entities of terrifying power that required multiple custodians working in coordination to bring down. The warriors of the Golden Guard, trained to fight as individuals rather than as coordinated units, had to adapt their tactics on the fly, learning to support one another in ways that went against their very nature. Constantin Valdor led from the front, his Apollonian spear reaping a terrible toll among the demonic host. He became a figure of legend even among the Custodes themselves, a tireless warrior who seemed to never rest, never falter, never show the strain of endless combat in conditions that would have broken lesser beings. But even Valdor could not be everywhere at once. And the Webway was vast. For every demon the Custodes banished, 10 more seemed to take its place. The siege of the Webway finally ended when the Emperor made the agonizing decision to abandon his great project. The Mechanicum forces were ordered to seal the portal permanently, trapping thousands of their own warriors on the far side, but finally ending the demonic incursion. The Emperor rose from the Golden Throne, weakened but still possessed of immense power, and turned his attention to the greater threat. Horus and his traitor legions were approaching Terra. The siege of Terra would be the final test of the Custodes' loyalty and prowess. The traitor forces arrived in overwhelming numbers, bringing with them a tide of chaos-corrupted warriors, mutants, demons, and traitor titans. The defenders of Terra, led by Rogel Dawn and his Imperial fists, prepared for the greatest battle humanity had ever known. The Custodes, bloodied but unbroken by their ordeal in the webway, took their positions at the most critical points of the palace's defense. The siege lasted for weeks, each day bringing new horrors and new challenges. The traitors assaulted the palace from every direction, using siege engines and orbital bombardments to reduce the ancient fortifications to rubble. The Custodes held the Eternity Gate, the massive entrance that led to the Emperor's throne room, against wave after wave of traitor space marines and demonic entities. This was their purpose, the moment they had been created for, standing between their master and certain death, selling their lives to buy him time. The battle at the Eternity Gate became legendary. Custodians fought alongside Dawn's Imperial fists and the Blood Angels under Sanguinius, creating a wall of ceramite and auramite that the traitors could not break. Chaos Space Marines, who had been brothers to many of the defenders just years before, threw themselves at the gate with fanatic fury. Greater demons manifested in the throne room itself, requiring the Custodes to fight battles on multiple fronts simultaneously.
I find myself wondering sometimes what it must have been like for those custodians who survived the heresy. They'd failed at the one thing they were literally created to do, and then they had to spend the next 10,000 years just standing there, watching everything their master built slowly fall apart. That kind of existential weight would crush most beings, but they endured it. I think that says something profound about duty and purpose, even if it's also kind of tragic in its own way. But anyway, let's get back to the story.
Constantin Valdor was everywhere during the siege, coordinating the defense, leading critical counterattacks, and personally slaying enemy champions who threatened to break through the defensive lines. He fought alongside the Primarchs, matching their prowess in ways that few other warriors could. When Horus himself breached the palace and began his final assault, while Valdor was one of the warriors who accompanied the Emperor in the teleportation attack on the War Master's flagship. The battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, was the culmination of everything the Custodes had been created for. The Emperor led a strike force deep into enemy territory, teleporting directly to confront his wayward son. Valdor and his Custodes fought through the ship's corridors, facing off against word-bearers and sons of Horus, who had been twisted by chaos into monstrous parodies of the noble warriors they had once been. But the ship itself seemed alive with malevolent intelligence, separating the Emperor from his guards and trapping Valdor and his warriors in a nightmare realm of demons and impossible geometry. Valdor fought with a desperate intensity, knowing that every moment he was separated from the Emperor was a moment when humanity's only hope stood alone against the greatest threat it had ever faced. He plunged his Apollonian spear into the deck of the ship itself, using its connection to the Emperor to verify that they were indeed aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and not lost in some warp-spawned illusion. Then he and his Custodes carved their way through the opposition, racing against time to reach their master. They were too late. By the time Valdor and his warriors fought their way to the Emperor's location, the confrontation with Horus was over. The War Master lay dead, his soul obliterated by the Emperor's full psychic might, but the price had been catastrophic. The Emperor himself had been mortally wounded, and his body broken in ways that even his phenomenal regenerative abilities could not heal. Rogel Dawn carried his father's shattered form from the ship, while Valdor and the surviving Custodes held the perimeter, ensuring that no traitor interference could prevent their withdrawal. The return to Terra was a journey through a nightmare. The Emperor lived, but barely, his consciousness flickering as his body struggled to hold together. The decision was made to place him upon the Golden Throne, using the same arcane technology that had once allowed him to hold the webway closed. But this time, the throne would have to sustain him indefinitely, keeping his body alive through artificial means, while his spirit waged an eternal war in the Imperium against the Chaos Gods themselves. For the Custodes, or the Emperor's enthronement, represented a failure beyond measure. They had been created to protect him, and they had failed. Their master now sat as a corpse upon a throne, neither fully alive nor fully dead, sustained only by the sacrifice of thousands of psykers every day. The golden warriors who had stood by his side for centuries could no longer hear his voice, except as the faintest psychic whisper. The man who had been their friend, their creator, their purpose for existing, was gone, replaced by a silent god who could no longer acknowledge their service. Constantine Valdor stood vigil over the emperor as he was placed upon the throne, watching as the greatest being humanity had ever produced was reduced to this half-life. The Captain General's face, normally stoic and composed, and it was said to have shown the barest hint of grief as the throne's mechanisms activated and the Emperor's psychic presence faded from direct contact. Valdor knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The Great Crusade was over. The dream of a unified humanity was shattered, and the Custodes would have to forge a new purpose from the ashes of their failure. In the aftermath of the siege, the Custodes changed their traditional red cloaks to black, symbolizing the darkness that had fallen upon their order. Many ceased wearing their armor entirely, except for their helms and cloaks, a visible expression of their shame at having failed to prevent the emperor's fall. They retreated within the walls of the imperial palace, swearing that never again would they allow any threat to reach the emperor. And never again would they venture far from his side. Never again would they serve anything but their singular, overwhelming purpose, to guard the golden throne until the stars themselves burned out. This self-imposed isolation would define the Custodes for the next 10,000 years, as the Imperium they had helped build slowly decayed around them, and the galaxy descended into an age of war and suffering that showed no signs of ending. The Golden Legion had survived the heresy, but at a cost that would echo through the millennia. The loss of their master's presence, and the burden of knowing that despite their legendary prowess, despite their unbreakable loyalty, they had ultimately failed in their most sacred duty. 10 millennia of vigil. The centuries after the Horus heresy transformed the Adeptus Custodes in ways both subtle and profound. And where once they had been the Emperor's companions, his friends and advisors who walked with him through the galaxy, they now became silent watchers over a tomb. The Imperial Palace, that vast complex that sprawled across the Himalayan mountains and extended deep into the bedrock of terror, became both their fortress and their prison. Within its adamantium walls and void-shielded corridors, the 10,000 golden warriors resumed their vigil, standing guard over the slowly decaying form of the Emperor as he sat immobile upon the golden throne. The change in their role was codified through the Edict of Restraint, a decree established by Rogel Dawn, Constantin Valdor, and Robert Guilliman in the aftermath of the heresy. This edict bound the Custodes to terror, forbidding them from venturing forth except under the most dire circumstances. But the reasoning was sound from a certain perspective. The Custodes were too valuable to risk in far-flung campaigns, and their primary duty had always been the Emperor's protection. With their numbers reduced to barely 1,000 after the horrific casualties of the Webway War and the Siege of Terror, they needed time to rebuild their strength. But the edict also represented a retreat, an acknowledgement that the grand vision of the Great Crusade had failed. The Imperium would continue without the Emperor's direct guidance, managed by the High Lords of Terror and defended by the Space Marine chapters that Guilliman organized from the broken legions. The Custodes would play no part in this new order except as silent guardians of a dying god. They served the Emperor, not the Imperium, and with the Emperor confined to his throne, as unable to give orders or even acknowledge their presence except through the faintest psychic emanations, they could do nothing but wait and watch. The isolation was not absolute. Individual custodians were occasionally dispatched on specific missions of critical importance to the Emperor's safety or the protection of Terra. But these deployments became increasingly rare as the centuries wore on. The Custodes developed an insular culture, one focused entirely on maintaining their readiness for a crisis that might never come, while the galaxy beyond Terra's walls burned. Their training continued with the same intensity it had always possessed, perhaps even more so. The blood games became more elaborate and frequent, with custodians spending years planning and executing attempts to breach the palace's defenses. These exercises served multiple purposes. They tested the security measures that protected the Golden Throne, they kept the custodians sharp and innovative in their tactical thinking, and they provided an outlet for warriors who might otherwise have gone mad from the endless monotony of guard duty. One particularly famous blood game saw a custodian successfully predict that a future attempt on the Emperor's life might involve infiltrating the palace staff and working as a servitor for years to gain access to restricted areas. This insight led to a comprehensive overhaul of the palace's servant population and the introduction of new verification procedures that are still in use 10,000 years later. Another custodian demonstrated that the palace's defensive measures assumed attackers would value their own lives, and constructed an elaborate scenario involving suicide operatives that exposed critical vulnerabilities. The Custodes also maintained their practice of studying every conceivable art and discipline. Where Space Marines were trained as warriors first and foremost, custodians were expected to be complete beings, masters of philosophy, history, diplomacy, and countless other fields. A custodian might spend decades studying the architectural styles of different human cultures, not because this knowledge had any immediate tactical application, but because understanding how humans built their cities revealed insights into how they thought and what they valued. This intellectual depth kept the custodians from becoming mere weapons, preserved the humanity that their augmentation might otherwise have stripped away. But despite their efforts, the isolation took its toll. The Custodes watched as the Imperium they had helped build slowly decayed. The High Lords of Terra, who governed in the Emperor's name, were often corrupt or incompetent. The administratum became increasingly bloated and inefficient. The ecclesiarchy arose and transformed the imperial truth into a religion, something the Emperor had explicitly forbidden. Entire sectors fell to alien invasion or chaos incursion, their populations exterminated or enslaved, while the Imperium's response was hampered by bureaucratic infighting and incompetence. The Custodes saw all of this, heard the reports, understood what was happening. They were not stupid. They knew that the Imperium was failing, that the Emperor's dream was being perverted and destroyed by those who claimed to serve him. But they did nothing, as their duty was to the Emperor himself, not to his Imperium. They had been bound by the Edict of Restraint, and perhaps more importantly, they had bound themselves by their own sense of shame and failure. They had failed to protect the Emperor during the heresy. They would not fail in their vigil over his throne, no matter what else happened in the galaxy beyond. There were exceptions, moments when the Custodes emerged from their self-imposed isolation to intervene in events that threatened Terra itself. During the Age of Apostasy, when the mad High Lord Goj Vandir ruled the Imperium with tyrannical cruelty, the Custodes played a critical role in ending his reign of terror. They allowed Alicia Dominica, leader of Vandir's personal bodyguards known as the Brides of the Emperor, and to enter the throne room and stand before the Emperor himself. What transpired in that moment remains a mystery, but Dominica emerged transformed, and shortly thereafter led her sisters in a rebellion that ended with Vandir's death. Centuries would pass where the Custodes might be glimpsed by outsiders only rarely, appearing as golden phantoms when some threat penetrated too close to the imperial palace. They became figures of legend rather than reality, their deeds sung in songs and their existence doubted by those who lived on distant worlds and had never seen terror. The common citizens of the Imperium knew of the Emperor and the Space Marines. But the Custodes faded into myth, becoming little more than decorative elements in artworks depicting the Emperor in his glory days. The Custodes themselves struggled with this irrelevance, but they were warriors without peer, trained and equipped to face the greatest threats the galaxy could produce. But they spent centuries doing nothing but standing guard and running training exercises. Some among them began to question whether their isolation served any real purpose. Others doubled down on their vigilance, arguing that the moment they relaxed, their guard would be the moment when catastrophe struck. Debates raged in the halls of the palace between those who believed the Custodes should serve the Imperium more actively and those who insisted that their duty was solely to the Emperor's person. They also grappled with the question of recruitment and replacement. The Custodes needed to maintain their numbers at 10,000, but the process of creating new custodians was complex and time-consuming. The Emperor himself had overseen each transformation during his active years, but now he sat silent upon the throne. The Custodes had to rely on the knowledge and techniques that had been preserved, carried out by veteran members who had learned the process from those who learned it from Valdor himself. Each new recruit represented not just the addition of a warrior, but the preservation of knowledge that could not be allowed to die. The recruits came from the same sources they always had: the children of Terran noble houses, infants who showed potential and whose families considered it the highest honor to offer them to the custodian guard. The transformation process began in early infancy, rewriting their genetic code at the most fundamental level. Those who survived, for not all did, would emerge as something more than human, bearing capabilities that would make them peers to the legendary heroes of old. These new custodians grew up in a very different order than their predecessors. Where Constantin Valdor's generation had known the Emperor as a living presence, had spoken with him and received his personal instruction, these younger warriors knew him only as a silent figure on a throne. They were taught the old ways, trained in the same disciplines, held to the same exacting standards. But there was a melancholy to their service, a sense that they were maintaining a tradition whose original purpose had been lost. The palace itself changed during these millennia. New defenses were added, ancient systems were maintained and upgraded, and the complex grew ever more elaborate and secure. The Custodes ensured that the protection around the Golden Throne became so comprehensive that breaching it would require resources and coordination beyond the capability of any potential enemy. Every possible approach was considered, every vulnerability addressed. The palace became not just a fortress, but a monument to paranoia justified by bitter experience. Through all of this, the Custodes maintained the fiction that they had never lost a battle. The administratum was forbidden from recording any engagement where the Custodes were present as a defeat. This was not simple arrogance, but a psychological necessity. The Custodes had to believe in their own invincibility, had to maintain the confidence that came from being the Emperor's finest warriors. To acknowledge defeat would be to acknowledge that they might fail in their ultimate duty, and that acknowledgement could lead to hesitation at the critical moment. But in their private moments, in the halls where outsiders never walked, the Custodes remembered their failures. They remembered the Webway War where hundreds of their brothers had fallen. They remembered the Siege of Terror, where they had been unable to prevent the Emperor's fall. They remembered 10,000 years of watching the Imperium decay while they did nothing. These memories were burdens that they carried silently, never speaking of them to outsiders, but never forgetting them either. And so the millennia passed. The Custodes stood their vigil. The Emperor sat upon his throne. Terror turned beneath its polluted skies. The galaxy burned with war and suffering. And the Golden Warriors waited, wondering if their vigil would ever end, if they would ever again walk among the stars as they once had, if the Emperor would ever again acknowledge their service with something more than silent psychic whispers. They had become living ghosts, legends that persisted in a galaxy that had moved on without them, guardians of a corpse god who might already be beyond saving. The nature of a custodian. To understand the Adeptus Custodes, one must first understand that they are not simply superior soldiers. They are not space marines writ large, nor are they humans with better equipment. Each custodian represents the culmination of the Emperor's mastery over genetic science, a unique individual crafted with an artisan's care rather than mass-produced from a template. Where the creation of a space marine is a relatively standardized process involving the implantation of 19 gene seed organs, the creation of a custodian is something altogether more profound and unreplicable. The process begins in infancy, with children taken from noble Terran bloodlines before they have developed beyond their first years of life. This is not arbitrary cruelty, but necessity. The transformation that will turn them into custodians requires starting with an undeveloped genetic canvas. The process involves rewriting their DNA at the most fundamental level, altering not just specific organs or systems, but every single cell in their bodies. This is why each custodian is unique, why no two share identical genetic profiles. The Emperor, and later those custodians who learned his techniques, made minute adjustments and refinements tailored to each individual subject. The survival rate is not recorded in any source available to outsiders, but it is known that not every child who begins the transformation completes it. The process is grueling, taking years and requiring the subject to endure pain that would kill an unmodified human many times over. But those who survive emerge as something transcendent, beings who stand at the peak of what humanity can achieve through genetic engineering and selective augmentation. A fully transformed custodian stands taller than even a space marine, their physiology refined beyond what the Astartes achieve through gene seed implantation. They possess strength sufficient to tear a normal human apart with their bare hands, speed that allows them to dodge bolter fire at close range, and reflexes so swift that they can respond to threats in timeframes measured in microseconds. Their bones are virtually unbreakable, their musculature enhanced to the point where they can fight for days without rest, and their organs are redundant and hyper-efficient to a degree that makes space marine biology seem crude by comparison. But the physical enhancements are only part of what makes a custodian. Their minds are equally transformed, granted processing power and memory capacity that allows them to master countless disciplines simultaneously. A custodian might be an expert swordsman, a master strategist, a philosopher of note, a diplomat skilled in navigating the most treacherous political waters, and a scholar of ancient history, all at the same time. They can speak dozens of languages fluently, understand the cultural nuances of hundreds of different human civilizations, and debate the finest points of imperial law with the same ease they demonstrate when dismembering enemies in combat. This intellectual depth is intentional and necessary. The Custodes were created to be the Emperor's companions, not just his guards. They needed to be capable of engaging with him on subjects that went far beyond tactics and warfare. They needed to understand philosophy and history, art and literature, science and theology. The Emperor surrounded himself with beings who could challenge his thinking, who could offer perspectives and insights that enriched his own understanding. The Custodes were meant to be worthy of that role. The training regimen that young custodians undergo is correspondingly comprehensive. They learn every form of combat known to the Imperium, master weapons ranging from simple blades to the most sophisticated energy weapons. They study enemy tactics and capabilities, learning to counter everything from basic human soldiers to the most exotic Xenos warriors. But they also learn the arts of infiltration and assassination, understanding that the greatest threat to the Emperor might not come from an army, but from a single skilled operative who could penetrate the palace's defenses through cunning rather than force. The blood games that the Custodes practice serve as the ultimate training exercise. A custodian participating in a blood game must attempt to reach the Emperor using any means necessary, treating the entire imperial palace as hostile territory and every other custodian as an enemy to be evaded or overcome. But they might spend months or years planning their attempt, creating false identities, establishing covers, and mapping out the palace's security measures. Some blood games involve elaborate scenarios where the participant poses as a servitor or palace functionary, spending years in their role to establish credibility before making their attempt. Others are more direct, testing whether skill and determination alone can overcome the palace's formidable defenses. The Custodes do not fight as brothers the way Space Marines do. There is respect between them, certainly, and they will coordinate when necessary. But each custodian is trained to operate as an independent warrior, a tower of might unto himself. This philosophical difference reflects their different purposes. Space Marines are soldiers meant to fight in armies, while custodians are guardians meant to stand alone against any threat. On the battlefield, a squad of custodians fights not as a coordinated unit, but as a collection of individual champions who happen to be fighting the same enemies. This independence extends to their psychology. Custodians do not have the same indoctrination that Space Marines receive. They are not conditioned to think of themselves primarily as members of a chapter or legion. Instead, they maintain a sense of individual identity while remaining absolutely loyal to their purpose. A custodian can question orders, offer dissenting opinions, and think freely about the nature of their duty and the Imperium they serve. This freedom of thought would be dangerous if not for the fact that every custodian shares an unbreakable loyalty to the Emperor that transcends any logical argument or psychological manipulation. The source of this loyalty has been debated. Some claim that the Emperor's own genetic material was used in the creation of the Custodes, making them his sons, in a literal sense similar to how Space Marines are sons of their primarchs. Others argue that the loyalty is psychological, the result of conditioning so subtle and comprehensive that it becomes indistinguishable from genuine devotion. The truth may be that it is both, that the Custodes carry within them something of the Emperor's essence, while also being trained from infancy to view his service as the highest possible calling. What is certain is that this loyalty is absolute. A custodian would die before betraying the Emperor, would endure torture beyond imagining, would watch worlds burn and civilizations fall, all without wavering if such was necessary to protect their master. This is not blind obedience, but rather an intelligent understanding that the Emperor represents humanity's best hope for survival and transcendence. The Custodes have stood in his presence, have felt the overwhelming psychic power he wields, have witnessed his genius and his vision. They know, with a certainty that cannot be shaken, that he is worth protecting regardless of the cost. The biological reality of being a custodian includes functional immortality. Unlike normal humans who age and die, custodians do not biologically age past a certain point. And a veteran custodian might be well over 1,000 years old, yet appear to be in the prime of physical condition. This longevity is not without its drawbacks, however. The Custodes who survived the Horus heresy have watched 10,000 years pass, have seen the slow decay of everything the Emperor worked to build, have experienced loss and grief on a scale that would shatter normal minds. They carry these burdens with stoic dignity, but the weight accumulates nonetheless. When a custodian believes he is no longer fit for duty, whether due to injury, psychological burden, or simply a sense that his time has passed, he undertakes a ritual known as the Emperor's Mercy. He bequeaths his armor and weapons to the colossal Hall of Names, where they are preserved as relics of those who have served. Then, disguised under a hooded black cloak that conceals his identity, he departs the palace and ventures into the galaxy. These wandering custodians, known only as Eyes of the Emperor, undertake missions of their own choosing, working to further the Emperor's interests in ways that go beyond simple guard duty. Some infiltrate enemy organizations, others hunt down threats to humanity that have escaped the Imperium's notice, and still others simply wander, bearing witness to the state of the galaxy, and perhaps seeking some form of meaning or closure before their end. The Custodes also possess a supernatural quality that defies easy explanation. Those who fight alongside them report that the Golden Warriors seem to exist under a special protection, as if the Emperor's hand shields them from harm. Their bullets and energy weapons that should find their mark mysteriously veer off course at the last moment. Psychic powers that should overwhelm them suddenly flicker and fail. This aura of protection is not infallible. Custodians can be killed, as the casualties of the Horus heresy grimly demonstrated, but it provides an additional layer of defense that makes them even more difficult to defeat than their physical prowess alone would suggest. To be a custodian is to exist as both more and less than human. More, because they possess capabilities that no unaugmented person could ever hope to achieve. Less, because they have been transformed in ways that separate them from the rest of humanity, that make normal human relationships and concerns seem distant and irrelevant. They are weapons, yes, but weapons with souls, with thoughts and feelings and dreams. They are guardians who have stood vigil for millennia, who have sacrificed everything, including their connection to the broader human race, in service to a single, overwhelming purpose: to protect the Emperor of mankind, no matter the cost. Organization and structure. The organizational structure of the Adeptus Custodes reflects their unique role as the Emperor's personal guard rather than a conquering army. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the Space Marine chapters or the sprawling bureaucracy of the Astra Militarum, the Custodes maintain a relatively flat organizational structure that emphasizes individual excellence and flexibility over mass coordination. Every custodian is expected to be capable of independent action, able to lead or follow as the situation demands, while making the formal ranks they hold more descriptive of their current role than prescriptive of their capabilities. At the apex of the Custodian Guard stands the Captain General, the Supreme Commander of the 10,000 and one of the most powerful individuals in the entire Imperium. The Captain General holds authority second only to the Emperor himself in all matters concerning the Imperial Palace and Terra's defense. Throughout Imperial history, the Captain General has often held a seat among the High Lords of Terra, granting the Custodes a voice in the governance of the Imperium, even during their long period of self-imposed isolation. The office of Captain General is not hereditary or appointed for life, though many have served for centuries before passing the mantle to a successor. The selection process remains obscure to outsiders, but it is known that the Captain General must be an exemplar among exemplars, a warrior whose skill approaches that of the legendary Primarchs of old. They must possess not just martial prowess, but also the political acumen to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics, and the strategic vision to ensure the Emperor's protection against threats that might not manifest for centuries. Beneath the Captain General is the Tribunate, a council of 10 custodians who formulate policy and advise on strategic matters. The modern Tribunate differs from its predecessor during the Great Crusade era, where the ancient tribunes were field commanders who led forces in battle. The current Tribunate serves in an advisory capacity, though individual tribunes may still take command of military operations when circumstances demand. Members of the Tribunate serve for a minimum of 10 years, ensuring continuity and institutional memory, while also allowing for fresh perspectives to enter the council periodically. The companions represent the inner circle of the Custodes, those warriors deemed worthy to stand in the Emperor's immediate presence within the throne room itself. This is the highest honor a custodian can achieve, a recognition that they have proven themselves in countless trials and possess the absolute discipline required to guard the Emperor's physical form day and night. The companions wear distinctive armor and are led by one of the tribunes, who coordinates their duties and ensures that the throne room's defenses remain impenetrable. The vast majority of custodians belong to one of several castes based on their combat specialization. Though all custodians receive comprehensive training in multiple disciplines regardless of their formal designation, these castes are organized around different fighting styles and roles rather than rigid specialty restrictions. The Haikanatoi, whose name derives from an ancient Terran military unit, meaning the able ones, form what might be considered the standard infantry of the Custodian Guard, though calling any custodian standard is a profound understatement. They are the custodian guard proper, equipped with guardian spears and sentinel blades, armored in the iconic golden plate that has become synonymous with the custodes in imperial iconography. When custodians deploy to a battlefield, it is most often hikanatoi who make up the majority of the force. Within the hikanatoi are several specialized roles. The custodian wardens are veterans who have proven themselves through centuries of service. They carry weapons of particularly ancient provenance and are entrusted with guarding the most critical approaches to the throne room. When a threat is deemed serious enough to require the deployment of the custodes' most experienced warriors, it is often the wardens who answer the call. The Aquilian Terminators, though technically separate from the main caste structure, represent the custodes' heavy assault specialists. Clad in tactical dreadnought armor that has been customized to custodian specifications, these warriors wade into the most dangerous combat zones where even standard custodian armor might prove insufficient. Their armor incorporates ancient technologies that make it superior even to the revered Terminator plate worn by Space Marine veterans, and their weapons are correspondingly devastating. An Aquilian Terminator is a walking fortress, capable of withstanding punishment that would obliterate lesser warriors while dealing destruction on a scale normally reserved for armored vehicles. The Virtus Praetors comprise the Custodes' rapid response force, warriors mounted on powerful Dawn Eagle jet bikes that allow them to cover vast distances at incredible speed. These Golden Riders conduct reconnaissance, execute lightning strikes against key targets, and intercept threats before they can reach the palace proper. The jet bikes they ride are works of art in their own right, and incorporating gravitic technology that makes them faster and more maneuverable than the jet bikes used by Space Marine assault squads. The Custodes also maintain a fleet of armored vehicles and walker units, though these are deployed more sparingly than their counterparts in other Imperial forces. Custodian dreadnoughts, known as contemptors, house warriors who have suffered injuries too severe even for their enhanced physiology to fully heal. Unlike Space Marine dreadnoughts, which often spend centuries in stasis between deployments, custodian dreadnoughts remain active and alert, their occupants contributing their wisdom and experience to the defense of the palace, even in their diminished state. The organizational structure of shield companies and shield hosts provides the tactical flexibility that the custodes require for their varied missions. A shield company is a temporary formation led by a shield captain, typically consisting of a few squads of custodians, support elements like Virtus Praetors, and possibly heavier units like dreadnoughts or vehicles. The composition is tailored to the specific mission at hand, with the shield captain given wide latitude to select warriors and equipment based on his assessment of what will be required. A shield host represents a larger force, multiple shield companies organized under a captain commander to undertake particularly significant operations. During the Great Crusade, shield hosts might have numbered hundreds of custodians. In the current era, a shield host typically deploys far fewer warriors, reflecting both the reduced circumstances of the Imperium and the custodes' reluctance to commit large numbers of their warriors to any single operation. Each shield host has its own heraldry and colors, subtle variations in the golden armor that allow those familiar with custodian tradition to identify which host a particular warrior belongs to. Some shield hosts have earned particular renown through their actions over the millennia. The emissaries imperatus are known for their diplomatic missions, warriors trained specifically in the arts of negotiation and statecraft, who serve as the emperor's envoys when the custodes must deal with external organizations. The Shadowkeepers guard the black cells beneath the palace, are ancient dungeons that contain the most dangerous prisoners and artifacts in imperial custody. The Aquilan Shield specializes in protecting individuals deemed critical to the Imperium's survival, essentially serving as bodyguards for people who might not even know they are being protected. The custodes maintain their own support infrastructure, including artificers who craft and maintain their equipment, apothecaries trained in the unique biology of custodian physiology, and logistics specialists who ensure that the palace's defenses remain supplied and operational. These support personnel are not custodians themselves, but are selected from the most skilled and trustworthy individuals available, bound by oaths of secrecy that ensure the inner workings of the custodian guard remain hidden from outside scrutiny. Yet the relationship between the custodes and the Sisters of Silence adds another dimension to their organizational structure. The Sisters, also known as the Silent Sisterhood, are an order of female warriors who possess the pariah gene, making them blanks who nullify psychic powers through their mere presence. During the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy, the Sisters worked closely with the Custodes, their anti-psychic abilities complementing the custodians' martial prowess. After the heresy, the Sisters were dispersed across the galaxy and their organization fractured. But in recent times, with Reboot Guilliman's return and his Dispensatus Anathema decree, the Sisters have been reformed and once again work alongside the Custodes, creating a combined force known as the Talons of the Emperor. This organizational structure, as with its emphasis on flexibility and individual excellence over rigid hierarchy, allows the Custodes to respond to threats ranging from assassination attempts by lone operatives to full-scale military invasions. A single custodian can operate independently for years if necessary, using his training and capabilities to accomplish missions that would require entire companies of Space Marines. Yet the same custodians can also coordinate as shield companies or shield hosts when circumstances demand collective action, bringing to bear a level of combat effectiveness that few forces in the galaxy can match. The Custodes do not maintain the elaborate chapter cults and honor codes that define many Space Marine chapters. They have no need for such constructs because their purpose is singular and their loyalty unquestionable, and every custodian knows exactly why he exists and what he is meant to do. This clarity of purpose, combined with their organizational flexibility and individual excellence, makes the Adeptus Custodes one of the most effective military forces in human history, despite their relatively small numbers. When the Golden Warriors march to war, their enemies know that they face warriors who are not just skilled and well-equipped, but who carry with them the personal authority of the Emperor himself. Legendary leaders. Throughout the 10 millennia since their founding, the Adeptus Custodes have been led by warriors of exceptional skill and dedication. But even among these paragons, certain names stand out as legends. There are custodians whose deeds and character have defined what it means to serve as Captain General and have shaped the course of Imperial history itself. Constantin Valdor, known as the First of the 10,000 and the Shield of the Emperor, was the first Captain General of the Legio Custodes, and perhaps the greatest warrior to ever hold that title. Valdor stood at the Emperor's side from the earliest days of the Unification Wars, witnessing the birth of the Imperium and helping to forge it through blood and determination. Where others saw a warlord conquering terror, Valdor understood the Emperor's true vision, a unified humanity ascending to claim its rightful place among the stars, free from the predations of chaos and the limitations that had kept it divided and weak for so long. And Valdor's relationship with the Emperor transcended the normal bond between master and servant. They were friends in a way that few could understand, two beings whose thoughts operated on levels beyond what ordinary humans could comprehend. The Emperor trusted Valdor absolutely, relied upon his counsel, and valued his presence in ways that he valued few others. Valdor, in turn, dedicated his existence to protecting and serving the Emperor, not out of obligation, but out of genuine devotion to a being he recognized as humanity's only hope for transcendence. As a warrior, Valdor was virtually peerless. His skills were said to approach those of the Primarchs themselves, those demigod sons of the Emperor who commanded the Space Marine legions. He wielded the Apollonian spear, as a master-crafted weapon believed to have been created by the Emperor's own hands during the Unification Wars. This spear combined a power blade of devastating sharpness with an integrated bolter of exceptional potency, making Valdor deadly at both range and in melee combat. In battle, he moved with a grace and precision that made even the finest Astartes seem crude by comparison. One account from the Horus heresy describes Valdor engaging 30 psychically enhanced Blademaster Astartes of the Thousand Sons simultaneously, warriors who were among the finest swordsmen in their legion. Valdor killed all 30 without sustaining a single wound, his spear moving so quickly that observers could barely track its motion. Another tale tells of how he fought alongside Primarchs during the Siege of Terra, matching their prowess and occasionally surpassing it through superior technique and centuries of experience. But Valdor was more than just a warrior. He served on the War Council during the Great Crusade, advising the Emperor on strategic matters and coordinating with the Primarchs when necessary. His political acumen allowed him to navigate the complex relationships between the Custodes and the Space Marine legions, maintaining the Custodians' authority without unnecessarily antagonizing the Emperor's sons. When the Horus heresy erupted, Valdor was one of the first to recognize the true scope of the threat and began preparing Terra's defenses months before the traitors could strike. During the Webway War, Valdor led the Custodes through years of grinding warfare against demonic hordes, as his leadership and personal courage holding the line when all seemed lost. He watched as hundreds of his brothers fell, each death a blow that struck at his very soul. But he never wavered in his duty. When the Emperor was forced to abandon the Webway project, Valdor coordinated the strategic withdrawal and ensured the portal was sealed, trapping thousands of their own warriors on the far side to prevent the demonic incursion from continuing. At the Siege of Terra, Valdor was everywhere. The fighting was fiercest. He coordinated the defense alongside Rogel Dawn, led counterattacks that drove back seemingly unstoppable advances, and personally slew enemy champions who threatened to break through the defensive lines. When the Emperor teleported aboard Horus's flagship for the final confrontation, Valdor was among the warriors who accompanied him, fighting through the ship's twisted corridors to reach their master's side. But he arrived too late. The Emperor had already been mortally wounded in his duel with Horus, his body broken beyond even his phenomenal regenerative abilities. Valdor watched as Rogel Dawn carried the Emperor's shattered form from the ship, and in that moment, something in the Captain General broke. He had failed. Despite everything, despite all his skill and dedication, despite the sacrifice of hundreds of his brothers, the Emperor had been wounded in ways that could not be healed. After the Emperor was enthroned upon the Golden Throne, Valdor threw himself into restructuring the Custodes for their new role as Eternal Guardians. He worked with Guilliman and Dawn to establish the policies that would govern the Custodes for the millennia to come, though his heart was no longer in the task. Where once he had been the Emperor's companion and friend, now he was merely the guardian of a corpse. The Emperor's psychic voice, once so clear and vibrant, was now barely a whisper, and Valdor no longer heard the guidance and counsel he had relied upon for centuries. Then, sometime after the heresy's conclusion, Constantine Valdor disappeared. The official records are sparse and contradictory, offering no clear explanation for where he went or why. Some whisper that he embarked on a final mission, a quest of such importance that it required the Captain General himself to undertake it personally. Others suggest that he could no longer bear the burden of watching over the Emperor's broken form and chose exile over continued service. Still others, the most optimistic, believe that the Emperor gave him one final task, a secret duty that would take him away from Terra for reasons that will only become clear at the appointed time. Whatever the truth, Valdor's disappearance left a void that would not be filled until Trajan Valoris assumed the mantle of Captain General Millennia later. Valdor had accumulated 1,932 names through his deeds before the assault on Terra, each name representing an achievement of such significance that it was inscribed on the inside of his armor as a mark of honor. These names, this legacy, would inspire generations of custodians who came after him, of warriors who would strive to embody even a fraction of what Constantine Valdor had represented. The centuries between Valdor's disappearance and Valoris's ascension saw many warriors serve as Captain General, each bringing their own strengths to the role, but none achieving the legendary status of the first of the 10,000. The Custodes endured, maintained their vigil, and slowly rebuilt their numbers after the catastrophic losses of the heresy. But there was a sense of diminishment, a feeling that something essential had been lost with Valdor's departure. Trajan Valoris, the 17th Captain General, brought new energy and purpose to the Custodes at a time when the Imperium desperately needed it. Before his elevation to the highest rank, Valoris had already distinguished himself as an Alaris custodian, one of the elite Terminators who represented the Custodes' heavy assault specialists. He had run 2 successful blood games, a record that remains unbroken to this day, demonstrating both his combat prowess and his ability to think like an assassin. His military achievements included the destruction of the Space Hulk Mournful Siren, the defeat of a major Genestealer cult, and spearheading a preemptive strike against a greenskin force that might otherwise have threatened Terra itself. But Valoris's true genius lay not just in his combat abilities, but in his strategic vision and his understanding that the Custodes could not remain isolated forever. He saw that the galaxy was changing, that threats were multiplying faster than the Imperium's decaying institutions could respond to them. Under his leadership, the number of blood games increased tenfold, ensuring that the palace's defenses remained as impenetrable as humanly possible. He strengthened the defenses of the stable warp routes into the Sol system, purged long-hidden cults from Terra's underhives, and launched numerous extrasolar strikes against threats that might have eventually targeted the throne world. Valoris wielded the Watcher's Axe, a masterfully crafted weapon forged in the wake of Constantin Valdor's disappearance and wielded by every Captain General since. This massive polearm blade crackled with golden lightning and could bisect armored vehicles with a single swing. The axe's haft incorporated the eagle's scream, a master-crafted bolt weapon that fired adamantium-tipped penetrator bolts at a ferocious rate, giving Valoris deadly capability at range to match his devastating melee prowess. Some whispered that Valoris possessed a mysterious artifact called the Moment Shackle, a relic from Terra's ancient past that granted its bearer limited ability to perceive potential futures. Whether this was true or merely rumor, Valoris certainly demonstrated an almost prescient ability to anticipate threats and prepare for events that others could not foresee. He positioned the Custodes to respond to the return of Robuta Guilliman as if he had known it was coming, having already laid the groundwork for reforms that would allow the Custodes to adapt to a new era of warfare. When Guilliman did return, awakened from his millennia-long stasis by the efforts of Belisarius Cawl and Ivrain of the Inari, Valoris recognized the opportunity it represented. Lest the Primarch's return galvanized the entire Imperium, providing a symbol of hope and a leader with the authority to make the sweeping reforms that the Imperium desperately needed. But it also created a complicated situation for the Custodes. Guilliman was a Primarch, one of the Emperor's own sons, but he was not the Emperor himself. What authority did he truly hold over the Custodes? Valoris navigated this situation with the same political acumen that Valdor had demonstrated during the Great Crusade. He recognized that Guilliman represented the best hope for imperial renewal in 10,000 years, and that opposing him would only weaken humanity's chances of survival. When demonic forces assaulted Terra during the Battle of Lion's Gate, Valoris personally led 4,000 custodians in a counterattack that drove back the invaders, demonstrating that the Golden Warriors had lost none of their legendary prowess despite their long isolation. After the battle, Valoris and Guilliman met privately to discuss the future role of the Custodes. What transpired in that meeting remains known only to them, but the results were clear. The Edict of Restraint was amended. The Custodes would no longer be bound to Terra, except for the companions who maintained their vigil over the Emperor's physical form. Shield companies and shield hosts would deploy across the galaxy, bringing the Emperor's wrath to his enemies and ensuring that the Imperium's most critical assets remained protected. This decision was not without controversy within the Custodes themselves. Some argued that leaving Terra violated their fundamental purpose, that the Emperor's protection should remain their sole concern, regardless of what happened in the broader Imperium. Others felt ashamed that they had stood idle for 10 millennia while the Emperor's dream decayed, and welcomed the opportunity to finally make a difference beyond the palace walls. Valoris listened to all perspectives, but ultimately made the decision that he believed the Emperor himself would have made. The Custodes would serve, actively and aggressively, in defense of humanity. Under Valoris's leadership, the Custodes have entered a new age of warfare. They fight alongside the Primaris Space Marines on Guilliman's Indomitus crusade, bringing their unmatched prowess to bear against the enemies of mankind. They hunt down threats that lesser forces cannot handle, from rogue inquisitors to Xenos artifacts of terrible power. But they stand ready to protect not just the Emperor's physical form, but his entire realm, understanding that in the current Dark Age, the two have become inseparable. Valoris himself serves as a High Lord of Terror, representing the Custodes on the governing council of the Imperium. This position, which Captain Generals have held intermittently throughout Imperial history, gives him a voice in the highest levels of Imperial policy. He uses this authority carefully, understanding that the Custodes must remain apart from political machinations, while still ensuring that the Imperium's decisions serve the Emperor's interests. These two leaders, Valdor and Valoris, separated by 10,000 years of history, represent the two great eras of the Adeptus Custodes. Valdor embodied the promise of the Imperium's birth. He is standing beside the Emperor as humanity reached for the stars and dreamed of transcendence. Valoris represents the grim determination of humanity's struggle for survival in an age of darkness, leading warriors who understand that failure is no longer an option. Together, they define what it means to be Captain General, to be the greatest warrior of an already legendary force, to bear the weight of humanity's hopes, and to serve until the very end, no matter the cost. Arms and armor. The equipment wielded by the Adeptus Custodes represents the absolute pinnacle of the Imperium's technological capabilities. Where Space Marines are equipped with mass-produced war gear designed for reliability and standardization across thousands of warriors, every piece of equipment carried by a custodian is a unique masterwork, crafted by the finest artificers in Imperial service and incorporating technologies that in some cases date back to the Dark Age of technology itself. To see a custodian fully armed and armored is to witness the Emperor's vision of perfect warriors made manifest in auramite and energy fields. The armor worn by custodians, properly called custodian plate or auramite armor, surpasses even the legendary power armor worn by Space Marine veterans in both protection and aesthetic magnificence. Auramite is an ancient alloy whose exact composition remains a closely guarded secret, produced in limited quantities by Martian forge masters who learned the technique from designs preserved since before the Age of Strife. This material provides superior protection to standard ceramite while weighing less, allowing custodians to move with a fluidity and grace that belies their size and the apparent bulk of their armor. Each suit of custodian armor is individually crafted to fit its wearer perfectly, a process that takes master artificers years to complete. The armor is not merely functional, but is also a work of art in its own right. Every surface is decorated with intricate designs, from the Aquila emblems that adorn the shoulder guards to the detailed scrollwork that covers the breastplate and greaves. Precious gems harvested from the depths of Terra and cut by skilled artisans are incorporated into the armor's decorations, catching the light and making custodians shimmer like walking statues of gold when they move. The armor's systems go far beyond the standard capabilities of power armor, where a Space Marine's armor provides enhanced strength and sealed environmental protection. Custodian armor incorporates technologies that make its wearer virtually unstoppable. The power systems are more efficient and more durable than those used in standard patterns, allowing custodians to fight for extended periods without rest or maintenance. The helmet's sensors are sophisticated enough to detect threats at ranges and in conditions that would blind lesser equipment, including proximity sensors sensitive enough to make it nearly impossible to catch a custodian by surprise. Perhaps most remarkably, The armor seems to be touched by the Emperor's own power in ways that defy rational explanation. Custodians report that their armor responds to their thoughts with an intimacy that goes beyond standard neural interface technology, and as if the machine spirit dwelling within the Auramite truly understands its wearer's intentions. Some suits have been in continuous service for millennia, passed down from fallen warriors to new recruits, and these ancient pieces of armor carry their own legends and honors inscribed within their interior surfaces. The weapons wielded by custodians are no less impressive than their armor. The Guardian Spear, that iconic polearm that has become synonymous with the Custodian Guard, represents the perfect fusion of melee weapon and ranged firepower. The spear's blade is a power weapon of exceptional quality, wreathed in an energy field that allows it to slice through even the thickest armor with contemptuous ease. The reach provided by the polearm design gives custodians an advantage in melee combat, as allowing them to strike at enemies before those enemies can close to effective fighting range. But the Guardian Spear is more than just a melee weapon. Integrated into the haft is a bolt weapon that functions as a highly accurate rifle, allowing custodians to engage targets at range with the same devastating effectiveness they bring to close combat. This dual functionality epitomizes the custodian philosophy. Every warrior should be capable of engaging any threat under any circumstances. A custodian armed with a Guardian Spear can seamlessly transition from ranged combat to melee and back again, never finding himself at a disadvantage regardless of how the tactical situation evolves. For custodians who prefer more specialized loadouts, there are Sentinel Blades and Presidium Shields. And the Sentinel Blade is a two-handed power sword of exceptional craftsmanship, slightly shorter than a Guardian Spear, but offering superior speed and maneuverability in close quarters. Custodians armed with Sentinel Blades can often be found paired with those carrying Presidium Shields, the storm shields of the Custodian Guard. These shields incorporate energy field technology that can turn aside even Lascanon fire, and their metal construction makes them formidable weapons in their own right, capable of crushing skulls and breaking bones with a single blow. The Custodes also employ ranged weapons when circumstances demand. The Adrastus Bolt Caliver is a specialized bolt weapon that fires ammunition larger and more powerful than the standard bolter rounds used by Space Marines. Each shell capable of blowing apart armored targets with a single hit. Even more devastating are the Adrathic weapons, disintegration devices that unmake matter at the molecular level, leaving nothing but fine ash where once stood armored warriors or armored vehicles. These archaeotech weapons are rare even among the Custodes, artifacts from humanity's golden age that cannot be replicated by current technology and must be carefully maintained lest their secrets be lost forever. For those rare occasions when even heavier firepower is required, the Custodes maintain armored vehicles of surpassing quality. The Coronis Grav Carrier is a transport vehicle that utilizes gravitic technology to achieve speeds and maneuverability impossible for standard Imperial transports. Its weapons can lay down suppressing fire that would shred entire companies of enemy infantry, while its armor and force fields can withstand punishment that would reduce a land raider to scrap. When a shield company needs to deploy rapidly to a combat zone, the Coronis allows them to arrive ready to fight, its grav engines allowing it to deposit warriors precisely where they are needed, without the dangers inherent in drop pod or aerial deployment. The Caladius Grav Tank represents the Custodes' answer to enemy armored vehicles and fortifications. This sleek vehicle mounts weapons capable of destroying super heavy tanks with single shots, while its own defenses make it extraordinarily difficult to disable or destroy. Like other custodian equipment, each Caladius is unique. Its machine spirit awakened and intelligent in ways that standard Imperial vehicles are not, allowing it to coordinate with its crew in ways that maximize both offensive capability and survivability. Perhaps the most revered vehicles in the custodian arsenal are the dreadnoughts, the walking sarcophagi that house warriors whose bodies have been too badly damaged to continue fighting in their original form. Custodian dreadnoughts differ significantly from their Space Marine counterparts in both capability and operation. The Contemptor Achilles pattern, the most common type of custodian dreadnought, is equipped with weapons and armor that make it superior to even the rare Contemptor patterns sometimes seen in Space Marine chapters. More significantly, the occupants of custodian dreadnoughts do not spend centuries in stasis between deployments. They remain active and conscious, continuing their studies and training, contributing their wisdom to the defense of the palace even when not deployed to combat zones. The equipment carried by individual custodians is rounded out by various specialized tools and weapons suited to particular missions. Misericordia daggers are traditional weapons carried by all custodians, symbolic of their duty to deliver mercy and justice in the Emperor's name. These are not ceremonial weapons, but deadly tools, perfectly balanced and capable of punching through armor when wielded with custodian strength and skill. Similarly, the various grenades and specialized ammunition types available to custodians represent the finest examples of such equipment available anywhere in the Imperium. What truly sets custodian equipment apart is not just its individual quality, but how it works together as a complete system. A custodian clad in auramite armor, carrying a guardian spear, bearing a misericordia, and specialized equipment tailored to his specific mission parameters, represents a fully integrated weapon system that has no equal in the Imperium. Everything from the armor's sensors to the spear's integrated bolter to the warrior's own enhanced biology works together seamlessly, allowing custodians to respond to threats with a speed and lethality that leaves enemies no time to react or adapt. And the maintenance and preservation of this equipment is a sacred duty undertaken by the palace's artificers and tech priests. When a custodian falls in battle, his equipment is recovered, if at all possible, and brought back to the palace. The armor is reconsecrated, repaired if necessary, and prepared to serve again. The weapons are similarly maintained, their machine spirits soothed, and their mechanisms checked for even the slightest wear. Some pieces of equipment have been in continuous service for 10,000 years, passed from warrior to warrior, each adding his own deeds to the weapon's legend. In an age where the Imperium struggles to maintain the technology it inherited from earlier eras, where most equipment represents inferior copies of superior designs that have been lost to time, the Adeptus Custodes maintain a level of technological excellence that seems almost miraculous. This is possible only because the Custodes have never lost the knowledge of how to create and maintain their equipment, have never allowed bureaucratic entropy or doctrinal rigidity to interfere with the practical necessities of keeping their war gear in perfect condition. They are the Emperor's companions, and they wield weapons and wear armor worthy of that sacred duty, golden angels of death whose very appearance on the battlefield is often enough to inspire allies and demoralize enemies before a single blow is struck. The return to war. For 10,000 years, the Adeptus Custodes stood their vigil within the imperial palace, watching as the galaxy beyond Terra's walls descended into an age of unrelenting war and suffering. Yet they maintained their strength, refined their skills, and waited for a threat that would justify their deployment. That threat came, but from a direction few could have anticipated: the return of one of the Emperor's own sons, a Primarch awakened from millennia-long stasis, and bringing with him the promise of imperial renewal and the reality of even greater dangers than the Imperium had faced before. Rabut Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines and Lord Commander of the Imperium during the Great Crusade, had fallen into stasis after being mortally wounded by his brother Fulgrim during the Horus Heresy. His body had been preserved in a stasis field on his homeworld of Macragge, a shrine visited by pilgrims who prayed for his return. 10,000 years later, through the efforts of Belisarius Cawl and Ivrain of the Inari Eldar, as Guilliman was awakened and healed of his wounds, he returned to find an Imperium that bore almost no resemblance to the civilization he remembered, a galaxy divided by the Great Rift, and an emperor who could no longer speak to his sons except through the faintest psychic whispers. Guilliman's journey to Terra was fraught with danger. The forces of the Thousand Suns and their patron deity, Tsench, assaulted his fleet as it approached Holy Terra, seeking to prevent the Primarch from reaching the throne world. The Custodes, monitoring the situation with their characteristic vigilance, recognized both the threat and the opportunity. A Primarch, one of the Emperor's own Genesons, was returning to Terra for the first time in millennia. If he could be protected and his strength added to humanity's defense, it might turn the tide of wars that seemed increasingly unwinnable. Custodian forces deployed to Luna, Terra's ancient moon, to reinforce Guilliman's beleaguered fleet. The Golden Warriors struck with devastating effectiveness, their appearance on the battlefield turning defeat into victory as they cut through Chaos Space Marines and demonic entities with the same contemptuous ease they had demonstrated during the Horus Heresy. For many of the younger Space Marines who had never seen Custodians in battle, this was a revelation. These were not just better equipped warriors, but beings who operated on an entirely different level of capability, each one a champion who could face multiple Astartes and emerge victorious. But the true test came immediately after Guilliman's arrival on Terra. The Chaos Godhorn, he taking advantage of the warp storms and dimensional instabilities caused by the Great Rift's formation, launched a massive demonic assault directly on Terra itself. This was the Battle of Lion's Gate, a nightmarish incursion where bloodthirsters and hordes of lesser demons materialized within sight of the Imperial Palace, intent on destroying the Golden Throne and the Emperor's half-living form upon it. For the Custodes, this assault represented both their greatest fear and their moment of redemption. An enemy had reached Terra itself, had threatened the Emperor in his very throne room, something they had sworn would never happen on their watch. Captain General Trajan Valoris personally led the defense, commanding 4,000 Custodians in a counterattack that drove back the demonic host. The Golden Warriors fought with a fury born of 10,000 years of guilt and shame, determined to prove that they had not grown soft during their long isolation. The battle raged through the palace grounds and the surrounding territory, with Custodians fighting alongside newly reformed Sisters of Silence, Imperial Guard regiments, and whatever Space Marines could be mustered for Terra's defense. Roboute Guilliman led the coordinated defense, his strategic genius allowing the disparate Imperial forces to work together effectively despite having no opportunity to train or coordinate before the battle. The Primarch and the Custodes fought side by side, bridging 10,000 years of separation in the crucible of desperate combat. When the battle finally ended, as with the demonic forces banished back to the warp and Terra saved from violation, the Custodes were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had been wrong. For millennia, they had told themselves that their duty was solely to protect the Emperor's physical form, that what happened in the broader Imperium was not their concern. But the Battle of Lion's Gate had demonstrated that in the current era, threats to the Emperor could come from anywhere, could manifest on Terra itself if the Imperium was weak enough that enemies could strike at its heart. Protecting the Emperor meant protecting the entire Imperium, and that required more than standing guard over his throne. Guilliman understood this perhaps better than anyone, yet he recognized that the Custodes represented an incredible military asset that had been essentially wasted for 10,000 years. Warriors of such capability could turn the tide of battles across the galaxy, could provide a core of excellence around which lesser forces could rally, could strike at threats that no other Imperial forces could effectively engage. But he also understood that the Custodes would never agree to deploy widely if it meant abandoning their primary duty to protect the Emperor. The solution came in a private meeting between Valoris and Guilliman, two leaders who recognized that the Imperium stood at a crossroads. They agreed to amend the Edict of Restraint, the decree that had bound the Custodes to Terra for millennia. A permanent garrison would remain on Terra, specifically the companions who maintained their vigil in the throne room itself. But shield companies and shield hosts would be permitted to deploy across the galaxy, bringing the Emperor's wrath to his enemies and ensuring that critical assets and individuals received the protection they needed. This decision was not made lightly, and it sparked intense debate within the Custodian Guard itself. Some warriors argued that any deployment away from Terra violated their fundamental purpose, that the Emperor's protection should remain their sole concern. They pointed out that the Custodes had reduced numbers compared to their strength during the heresy, and every warrior sent away from Terra was one less defender should enemies strike at the throne. Others, particularly younger custodians who had never known the Emperor as anything but a silent figure on a throne, welcomed the opportunity to finally make a difference in the broader struggle for humanity's survival. Valorous sided with those who favored deployment, arguing that the Emperor himself would have wanted his Custodes to serve humanity actively rather than standing idle while the Imperium burned. The Captain General's authority, combined with the practical reality that the Battle of Lion's Gate had exposed the Custodes' failings, carried the day. The Golden Warriors would march to war once more, not as conquerors, but as protectors, bringing hope to humanity's defenders and destruction to humanity's enemies. The deployment of Custodian forces to war zones across the galaxy has had dramatic effects wherever they appear. On worlds besieged by Chaos cultists or Xenos invaders, the arrival of even a small shield company can turn the tide of battles that seemed lost. The psychological impact of seeing golden armored warriors who bear the Emperor's personal authority is as significant as their combat effectiveness. Imperial commanders, who might have been ready to order retreat or surrender, find their resolve stiffened by the presence of custodians fighting alongside them. The Custodes have also taken on roles beyond simple combat deployment. The Aquilan Shield, a specialized shield host, now operates across the galaxy, identifying individuals whom they deem critical to the Imperium's survival and providing protection, whether those individuals know it or not. These might be Imperial commanders whose strategic genius is essential to winning particular campaigns, or tech priests who possess knowledge that cannot be allowed to fall into enemy hands, or even ordinary citizens whose actions at critical moments could swing the fate of entire sectors. Other custodians serve as investigators and inquisitors, tracking down threats that have escaped the notice of the Inquisition or the Arbites. Their authority allows them to requisition any Imperial resources they deem necessary, and their training makes them virtually impossible to deceive or evade. Corrupt officials who have grown accustomed to operating with impunity find themselves facing golden armored judges who cannot be bribed or intimidated, whose loyalty to the Emperor is absolute, and whose judgment, once rendered, is final. And the Custodes have also re-established their practice of sending individual warriors as observers and liaisons to critical military operations. During the Indomitus Crusade, Guilliman's grand campaign to stabilize the Imperium after the Great Rift's formation, Custodians have fought alongside Space Marine chapters, providing both direct military support and ensuring that Guilliman's orders are carried out faithfully. Their presence serves as a reminder that the Primarch speaks with the Emperor's authority, deterring potential dissent from chapters who might otherwise question his directives. But even as they deploy across the galaxy, the Custodes maintain their core mission of protecting the Emperor. The companions still stand vigil in the throne room, never leaving the Emperor's immediate presence. The palace's defenses remain as formidable as ever, with the majority of the 10,000 still based on terror and ready to respond to any threat that approaches the throne world. The blood games continue, perhaps more intensely than ever, as custodians test whether the reduced garrison might make the palace vulnerable to infiltration or assault. This new era has brought the Custodes into closer contact with other imperial organizations than they have had since the heresy. They work alongside Space Marine chapters, coordinate with the Inquisition, requisition support from the Astra Militarum, and even occasionally cooperate with the Adeptus Mechanicus on technical matters. These interactions are not always smooth. The Custodes' authority and standards can clash with the pride or procedures of other organizations. But they are necessary if the Imperium is to survive the current age of darkness. the Sisters of Silence have been fully reintegrated into the Imperial war machine through Guilliman's Dispensatus Anathema decree, and they often deploy alongside custodian forces as the talons of the Emperor. This combination of the Custodes' martial prowess and the Sisters' anti-psychic capabilities creates a force especially effective against demonic and psychically enhanced enemies. Together, they represent perhaps the closest thing the Imperium currently possesses to the combined arms forces that fought during the Great Crusade. Thus, the return to active warfare has transformed the Custodes in subtle but significant ways. Warriors who had spent centuries standing guard, training, but never truly testing themselves against real enemies, have now experienced modern warfare in all its brutality and chaos. They have adapted their tactics to account for enemies and situations that did not exist during the heresy. They have learned to work with allies whose capabilities and limitations differ dramatically from the forces they remember from 10,000 years ago. And they have rediscovered a sense of purpose that goes beyond simple guardianship, understanding that protecting the Emperor means protecting everything he built and everything he dreamed humanity could become. This new era is not without its costs and controversies, and some custodians have fallen in battles across the galaxy, their lives spent defending worlds they had never heard of against enemies they had never encountered before. Each death is mourned, for custodians cannot be easily replaced, and every loss diminishes the Emperor's ultimate defense. Questions arise about whether the benefits of deployment justify the risks, whether custodians are being used wisely or squandered in engagements that lesser forces could handle. But these concerns are outweighed by the undeniable fact that the Custodes are making a difference. Worlds that would have fallen now stand. Enemies that seemed unstoppable have been defeated. The Golden Warriors, who for 10 millennia seemed like artifacts from a bygone age, have proven that they remain as deadly and as necessary as they were when the Emperor first created them. The 10,000 have returned to war, and the galaxy trembles at their tread. The 10,000 in battle. To witness the Adeptus Custodes in combat is to see warfare elevated to an art form, a perfect synthesis of skill, equipment, and purpose that few forces in the galaxy can match. Unlike the massed armies of the Astra Militarum, or even the coordinated operations of Space Marine chapters, custodian warfare revolves around the actions of individual champions who operate with a level of independence and capability that makes each one effectively an army unto himself. This fundamental philosophical difference in how they approach battle stems from their original purpose. They were never meant to be soldiers in a conquering army, but rather guardians capable of standing alone against any threat. When a custodian enters battle, he does so with a level of awareness and analysis that goes far beyond simple tactical assessment. Every aspect of the battlefield is considered: the terrain, the enemy's capabilities and probable tactics, the locations of allies and how best to support them, potential threats that might not yet be visible, and countless other factors that all feed into split-second decision-making. This level of tactical sophistication is possible only because of the custodians' enhanced mental capabilities and their centuries of training in every conceivable combat scenario. A custodian does not fight as part of a battle line the way Space Marines do, supporting his brothers through coordinated fire and mutual assistance. Instead, he operates as an independent warrior who happens to be fighting alongside other independent warriors. Each custodian identifies priority targets, selects his approach, and executes his plan with deadly efficiency. This can sometimes appear to be arrogance or recklessness to those unfamiliar with custodian capabilities, seeing golden armored warriors charge into situations that would require careful coordination from Space Marines. But what appears to be individual glory-seeking is actually the result of each custodian making independent tactical assessments and trusting his brothers to do the same. This does not mean custodians cannot or will not coordinate when circumstances demand it. Shield companies and shield hosts have command structures and tactical plans that guide their overall operations. But even within these formations, individual custodians are given tremendous latitude to respond to battlefield developments as they see fit. A shield captain might designate priority targets and general approaches, but he trusts each custodian to accomplish his assigned objectives through whatever means seem appropriate. The typical engagement involving custodians begins long before the actual combat. Intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and careful planning characterize custodian operations. They study their enemies exhaustively, learning strengths and weaknesses, identifying command structures and critical assets, and developing detailed plans that account for multiple contingencies. This preparation might seem at odds with their philosophy of individual action, but it actually enables it. A custodian who understands his enemy thoroughly can make better independent decisions during the chaos of combat. When combat is joined, custodians strike with devastating speed and precision. Their tactics emphasize overwhelming force applied at critical points rather than grinding attritional warfare. A shield company might deploy to defend a critical position, but rather than simply holding ground, they will identify enemy command elements or heavy support assets and eliminate them in lightning raids that leave the enemy force leaderless and disorganized. The combination of their incredible mobility, superior equipment, and individual capability allows them to operate inside the enemy's decision-making cycle, striking before opponents can effectively respond. Against numerically superior forces, which is almost always the case given the custodies' small numbers, they employ tactics that maximize their individual superiority while minimizing their exposure to massed fire. That they use terrain and cover effectively, not out of cowardice, but out of tactical sense. They identify enemy units that pose the greatest threat and eliminate them first. They create opportunities for devastating counterattacks that break enemy formations and morale. A force of 10 custodians can accomplish objectives that might require a company of space marines, not through any mystical power, but through superior skill, equipment, and tactical acumen. The psychological impact of custodians on the battlefield cannot be overstated. Allies who fight alongside Golden Warriors find their courage and determination strengthened, knowing that they stand with the Emperor's personal champions. Enemies who face custodians often break before physical combat even begins, are unable to cope with the sight of towering warriors in gleaming armor who move through battle like avenging demigods. Even disciplined enemies like Chaos Space Marines or professional alien warriors have been known to falter when faced with custodian forces, recognizing that they face opponents beyond their capability to defeat. Custodian combat doctrine emphasizes flexibility and adaptation. While they train extensively in set-piece battles and conventional warfare, they are equally comfortable conducting special operations, hostage rescue, assassination, or urban warfare. Their comprehensive training means that no combat scenario catches them unprepared. No tactical challenge lacks a solution. When fighting in environments that would handicap other forces, such as zero-gravity void combat, or in the twisted geometries of the webway, yet custodians adapt their tactics seamlessly, drawing on their extensive experience and training to operate effectively regardless of the circumstances. Against specific enemy types, the custodians employ specialized tactics developed over millennia of warfare. When facing hordes of less capable enemies like cultists or basic greenskin warriors, they use ranged weapons and area denial tactics to maximum effect. Their guardian spears integrated bolters, allowing them to thin enemy ranks before melee is even joined. Against elite enemies like Chaos Space Marines or Xenos champions, they rely on their superior skill in close combat, using their guardian spears' reach and power to strike before enemies can respond effectively. Demonic enemies represent a particular challenge that the Custodes have extensive experience combating, and dating back to the war in the Webway. Against such foes, the Custodes often coordinate with the Sisters of Silence, whose pariah nature disrupts the warp-based existence of demons and makes them vulnerable to physical attacks. The Custodes have also developed tactical doctrines specifically for fighting in warp-corrupted environments where reality itself becomes unstable, learning to trust their training and equipment rather than their senses when those senses might be deceived by chaos trickery. The Custodes' approach to combined arms warfare differs from standard Imperial doctrine, where most Imperial forces rely on clear delineations between infantry, armor, and air support, with complex coordination required to effectively employ these different elements together. The Custodes integrate their various capabilities more fluidly. Our Virtus Praetors on jet bikes function as both rapid response units and heavy cavalry, capable of devastating charges, but also able to provide fire support or reconnaissance as needed. Custodian dreadnoughts serve as both mobile weapons platforms and sources of tactical wisdom, their occupants contributing strategic insight based on centuries of experience. When deploying their armored vehicles, the Custodes use them not as mere fire support, but as integral elements of highly mobile operations. A Coronis grav carrier might deliver a shield company directly into the heart of enemy formations, its weapons suppressing enemy fire, while the Custodians disembark and engage in close combat. Caladius grav tanks operate as hunter-killers, seeking out enemy armor and heavy weapons positions and destroying them with precision fire that leaves surrounding structures intact. The Custodes have also proven adept at working with other Imperial forces, despite their very different operational philosophies. When assigned to support Space Marine operations, they typically operate semi-independently, accepting overall strategic objectives from Space Marine commanders, while executing those objectives through their own tactical approaches. This can create friction, particularly with chapter masters who are used to having complete control over all forces in their area of operations. But it also creates opportunities for combined operations that leverage the strengths of both force types. Similarly, when the Custodes operate alongside Astra Militarum forces, they function as an elite strike force that can accomplish objectives beyond the Guard's capabilities, while the Guard provides the mass and holding power that a few dozen Custodians cannot match. This combination can be devastatingly effective, with Guard forces pinning enemies in place while Custodians maneuver to strike at critical vulnerabilities, or Custodians breaking through fortified positions that the Guard can then exploit. The question of acceptable losses represents a fundamental difference between Custodian doctrine and that of other Imperial forces. For the Astra Militarum, losses are expected and even planned for, with commanders calculating how many soldiers they can afford to spend achieving particular objectives. Space Marines are more cautious with their warriors' lives, are recognizing that each Astartes represents a significant investment, but they will still accept casualties when objectives demand it. The Custodes take a much more conservative approach, unwilling to accept casualties except when absolutely necessary. This is not cowardice, but rather a recognition of reality. Custodians cannot be easily replaced, and every death diminishes the Emperor's ultimate defense. Shield captains plan their operations meticulously to minimize risks while still accomplishing objectives. They prefer to overwhelm enemies quickly, rather than engaging in extended campaigns that might result in attrition. When facing situations where casualties seem inevitable, they look for alternative approaches that might achieve similar results at lower cost. Despite this conservative approach to casualties, the Custodes are not afraid to sacrifice themselves when necessary. Their loyalty to the Emperor is absolute, and they will gladly die if their death serves his interests. But they die efficiently, trading their lives for maximum impact, rather than squandering themselves in futile gestures. A Custodian who knows he cannot survive a particular engagement will ensure that his death accomplishes something significant, whether that be holding a critical position long enough for reinforcements to arrive, or eliminating an enemy commander who poses a threat to Imperial forces. The Battle of Lion's Gate demonstrated Custodian combat doctrine on a large scale, with 4,000 warriors deploying to defend Terra itself against a massive demonic incursion. The Custodes fought with a fury and desperation born of 10,000 years of guilt, though determined to prove that they had not grown soft during their long isolation. They struck at the demonic forces with devastating effectiveness, their coordination allowing them to concentrate overwhelming force at critical points, while avoiding being drawn into grinding attritional battles that would have favored the numerically superior demon host. Other engagements across the galaxy have shown the Custodies adapting to new threats and new battlefield conditions. Against Necron tomb complexes that began awakening across the Imperium, shield companies have struck with precision timing to catch the ancient Xenos before they could fully mobilize their forces. Against Orc invasions that threatened critical Forge worlds, Custodians have eliminated war bosses and disrupted greenskin command structures, are causing entire forces to fragment into infighting. Against Tyrannid splinter fleets, they have struck at synapse creatures, severing the psychic links that coordinate the swarm, and turning devastating invasions into disorganized feeding frenzies that conventional Imperial forces can more easily contain. The return to active warfare has proven conclusively that the Custodies remain as deadly as they were during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. They have lost none of their legendary skill despite 10 millennia of relative isolation. They have adapted to new enemies and new tactical realities without losing the essential characteristics that make them unique. When the Golden Warriors take to the battlefield, they bring with them the Emperor's wrath and the promise that no threat, no matter how powerful, can stand against warriors who were personally crafted by humanity's greatest champion. The galaxy has been reminded that the 10,000 are not relics or legends, but living weapons of terrible effectiveness, and their enemies have learned to fear the sight of golden armor gleaming on distant battlefields. Conclusion: Eternal Guardians. 10,000 years have passed since the Emperor sat upon the golden throne, his body broken but his spirit undiminished, his psychic might holding back the tides of chaos that would otherwise consume humanity. Throughout those long millennia, the Adeptus Custodes have stood their vigil, the Golden Warriors who serve not the Imperium, but the Emperor himself, maintaining a loyalty and dedication that has never wavered despite the darkness that surrounds them. The story of the Custodes is one of transcendence and tragedy, of warriors created to be perfect who have lived long enough to witness the failure of every dream and hope they once held. They have seen the Emperor's grand vision of a united humanity ascending to claim its rightful place among the stars, reduced to an Imperium that barely clings to survival, where every day brings new threats and every victory is merely a prelude to the next crisis. They have watched as the civilization they helped build slowly decayed, corrupted from within by the very forces the Emperor fought to defeat. Yet, they have endured. Through 10,000 years of watching over a dying god, through centuries of isolation and shame, through the gradual realization that their failure to prevent the Emperor's fall would define them forever, and they have maintained their purpose and their discipline. They have remained the Emperor's companions, his friends and guardians, even when he could no longer acknowledge their service. They have preserved the traditions and techniques he taught them, ensuring that future generations of custodians would be as skilled and as dedicated as those who stood by his side during the Unification Wars. The recent return to active warfare marks a new chapter in the Custodes' long history. For the first time in millennia, the Golden Warriors walk among the battlefields of the galaxy once more, bringing hope to humanity's defenders and destruction to its enemies. They have adapted to a galaxy that has changed dramatically since the heresy, learning to fight new enemies and work with allies who have no memory of the Great Crusade. Yet they remain fundamentally what they have always been: guardians of unmatched skill and unwavering loyalty, warriors who serve a higher purpose than simple survival. The Custodes represent something precious and increasingly rare in the grim darkness of the far future, a connection to the Emperor's own vision and his own hand. They are living proof that humanity can create wonders, can transcend its limitations, can produce warriors and scholars and champions who stand as equals to the legendary heroes of myth. Every custodian carries within him a spark of what the Emperor intended humanity to become, refined and perfected through genetic science and psychological training into beings who approach the ideal of what humans might be if freed from the constraints of biology and circumstance. But they also represent a warning about the costs of that transcendence. The Custodes have sacrificed everything for their purpose. Their connection to broader humanity, their freedom to choose their own paths, their ability to rest or find peace. They are weapons, however willing, shaped and honed for a single, overwhelming duty. They cannot truly live as normal humans do because they are no longer truly human, no matter how much humanity they retain in their thoughts and feelings. As the Imperium faces an age of unprecedented darkness, with the Great Rift splitting the galaxy and enemies pressing from every direction, the Custodes stand ready to meet these threats with the same dedication they have shown for 10 millennia. They know that the battles ahead will be desperate, that losses are inevitable, that the odds of human civilization surviving another 10,000 years seem increasingly remote. But they also know that the Emperor still lives, still fights, still protects humanity through his presence on the Golden Throne, and as long as he endures, so too will they. The 10,000 march to war once more, their golden armor gleaming in the light of burning worlds, their weapons ready to strike down any who would threaten their master or his realm. They are the Emperor's companions, his friends, his most trusted servants. They are the ultimate guardians, the living embodiment of what loyalty and dedication can achieve. They are the Adeptus Custodes, and they will stand watch over the Emperor and humanity until the last star burns out and the galaxy falls silent. Their story is far from over. New challenges await. New enemies must be faced, and new sacrifices will be demanded. But the Golden Warriors who stood by the Emperor's side during the birth of the Imperium will stand by his throne until its end, however that end might come. They have kept their vigil for 10,000 years through darkness and despair. They will keep it for 10,000 more if that is what is required, because that is what the Emperor created them to do, and they will never, never fail in that sacred duty again. If you enjoyed learning about the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000 Golden Guardians who stand as humanity's ultimate defense, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us create more deep dives into the lore of Warhammer 40,000, exploring the factions, characters, and events that make this universe so compelling. Thank you for watching, and remember, the Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.